But the other thing that you should have in the back of your mind is that, ultimately, what is the risk of getting this wrong? You're required to do these things, but what happens if you don't? And that may seem like an obvious question, but when you look at it from the other end, from the HMRC enforcement end of the scale, it sheds a whole different light on what you're doing now, and actually makes it even more important to get this right. So typically, the revenue, particularly at the moment, they are under-resourced. They're still pretty effective, but they don't have limitless staff. They can't investigate everybody, but they are getting more and more effective, particularly in the staffing sector. They have been collecting information and joining up through pretty powerful databases for a few years now. So they are in a much stronger position now than they were, say, 5 years ago, to piece things together and take some fairly persuasive enforcement action. But what typically happens is that they leave it until the last minute to bring the enforcement action. So in a PAYE action, unless there has been a deliberate attempt to avoid the PAYE tax, the revenue have got 4 years within which to bring enforcement action. And what we've seen is that they use that 4 years. So towards the end of February each year, we see lots of assessment notices going out there, protective assessment notices going out there to people who they think might be assessed, have been assessed wrongly, and who owe them quite a lot of tax and NI. So this will all be implemented. It will start to bed down. Complacency will start to creep in, because it always does. And people will say, well, nothing's happened. The revenue haven't done anything. That was all a big waste of time, wasn't it? Well, nothing is going to happen for 4 years. And then suddenly you'll think, oh my God. And then they'll start to test the water. They'll start to bring some cases. And once they've got their heads around how they're going to enforce it, then it'll start to, the gloves will be off. And they'll probably choose a fairly large organisation. I mean, it's not directly relevant to this, but they served assessment notices on, I think it was 350 PSC contractors at GSK 2 weeks ago. That wasn't under the new rules, that's under the existing rules, but it was a real shot out over the bows to say, look, we want to make you, GSK, sit up and think very carefully about this. We need you to make sure you've assessed your contractors correctly. In fact, we want most of them to be assessed as inside IR35, because if you don't, we're coming after you. And ultimately, the legislation is pretty wide. It does say that the revenue have discretion to assess whoever they want to. So if they can see that there's been some kind of failure to implement this properly, they could ultimately go after whoever they want to in the supply chain to enforce it. And that could be you as an end user. There would usually have to be some kind of breakdown in responsibilities down the supply chain, but ultimately they do have the power to do that. And that's how the revenue operate. They choose a large target, something that's going to make a big splash, make a big noise, and that drives their enforcement effort going forward. They make an example of somebody, and then people tend to sit up and take notice and fall into line. So I think that's useful to know, because in the meantime, until that enforcement action starts to hot up and become a real sort of risk for anybody who's dealing with this, it's really important to make sure you've got all the right evidence in place and systems to collect and store that evidence, so that should you need to justify any assessment you've made between now and when enforcement assessment might be raised, you have got that information, because the revenue will put you to proof. They'll say, right, you issued this assessment, you've proved to us that it was right and it was done with reasonable care. Well, the same rules apply to the contract, so their liability goes back 4 years unless there's been yeah, well, I mean, it could potentially go 6. I think that the standard is 4. I mean, if there's been a sort of outright fraud, they can go about 20. But I think it's, just work on the basis it's going to be 4 for PAYE, 6 years for national insurance. Now, the contractor's liability will flip on the 6th of April 2020. So they will no longer be the taxpayer for these purposes. It will be the responsibility of the fee payer to deduct that tax. So they will be the organisation who is assessed or challenged by HMRC initially. But because they're part of a supply chain, the revenue will work their way up the supply chain to wherever the failure has occurred. Mm-hmm. So if the failure is that a notice of assessment hasn't been passed on, then they will go to whoever has failed to do that, and they'll start looking at asking them questions. If there's been no assessment at all, they'll go straight to the end user. So that's why you need to have this evidence. You need to be able to show that you've done your assessment, and as far as you're aware, it's a proper assessment. We've done what we need to do. Somebody else's responsibility now. So yeah, I can't stress the importance of having that evidence. So anything you've got that can automate that and automate the record keeping on that is going to be incredibly useful. Yeah, you should, if there is an umbrella company involved or a third-party fee payer involved in the supply, it doesn't matter if it's a PSC or an umbrella contractor or anyone else, ideally you should be carrying out due diligence on them just to make sure that you're satisfied they are who they say they are. They're not a shop window for something else, because there's all sorts of loan schemes, there's all sorts of offshore arrangements, split payments, you name it, they go on. And you are, as an end user, a few steps removed from the actual payment. So ultimately what you want to be able to check is that the contractor is getting paid in a way that is consistent with your understanding of, if they're outside IR35, okay, they can get paid gross, but who's actually paying them? As soon as you introduce an extra intermediary into the supply chain, you've immediately got a bit more of a question mark, and that's an extra layer for you to check. And those checks should be updated. You should carry out spot checks. It's not enough just to say, right, we'll have you on a PSL or something. You do need to update those checks. We've seen this, a lot of umbrellas pass a certain hygiene test, shall we say, and then we've found out from someone else that they're doing loan schemes. So, that's just an example. So regular checks and checking the pay slips, and somehow, if you can, get the pay slips from the actual contractors, the ones that they are issued with, because those are the real ones, not the official ones.